Obviously, today's panel is about the distressing situation in Libya. We have a great panel to take us through some of the issues, the players, and the scenarios in Libya. Obviously, Libya was a country that perhaps started off with some optimism after the fall of Gaddafi. They held a number of elections. They started in the process of drafting a constitution, but things went increasingly south, as they say, in 2013 and 2014, until we've reached a situation today where there is no real central government. The country is divided between two rival coalitions, two rival governments, two rival prime ministers. The conflict has also drawn in regional support from different camps, fueling to a large degree this conflict. The UN has attempted to mediate, but so far without great success. Meanwhile, the economic situation, in addition to the security situation, continues to deteriorate, getting particularly dire with the collapse of oil prices a few weeks ago, putting in question the future of the public finances, the public sector, which keeps much of the families and economy afloat. There's a lot to go through. It's a very complicated situation, and a situation which has generated security problems for the neighbors of Libya, as well as for Europe and the West. Our panel is composed of three people who work and have worked intensively on the questions of Libya. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will speak. To my immediate left is Mr. Jason Pack. Jason is a researcher of Middle East history at Cambridge University, and he is the president of Libya-Analysis.com. He writes extensively on Libya, researches a lot, and runs a consultancy which works with European, NATO, and other institutions trying to find policy options for the crisis in Libya. His analysis and articles have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and many other outlets, and we're very happy to have him with us today. To his left is an old friend, Mr. Karim Mezran. Karim is a Libyan Italian scholar. He ran an institute in Rome, the Center for American Studies in Rome, for many, many years, but we are lucky now to have him here in Washington, D.C. He is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. He writes extensively on Libyan affairs and on North Africa in general, and published widely in the Italian and international press. We're happy to have him with us as well. To his left is Ambassador David Mack. Ambassador Mack has had a long, distinguished career with the U.S. Foreign Service. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs between 1990 and 93. Before that, he served as ambassador to the UAE, and he also was in Libya at the time of Gaddafi's takeover in '69, and served at the embassy there for a few years, and has kept a lot of contacts and connections in Libya and follows Libyan affairs very, very, very closely. Ambassador Mack was also briefly president of the Middle East Institute a few years ago, and he ceded power without an uprising, without any, to our current leader, Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain. So I welcome them all here today. We're going to give each around 10 to 15 minutes to make their opening statements. Then I will, have a few questions for the panel, and then we will turn it over for the audience. So Jason, let's start with you.
Well, thanks for that kind introduction, Paul, and thanks to Paul, Megan, Wendy, and the Middle East Institute for putting together this great event at such last notice. And I'm honored that you all braved the cold, the snow, and apparently this exciting manhole explosion, which shut down electricity for a while in this area of DC and almost made our event today impossible. So it's a great pleasure to present some of my blue sky thinking and its implications in a room where I see so much commitment to rethinking the Western policies towards Libya that have clearly proved themselves ill-equipped to deal with the depths of the crisis that the country has fallen into over the past months. Given the gravity of the current situation in Libya and the large extent to which it threatens core Western interests in the field of counterterrorism, migration to Europe, arms proliferation, and the destabilization of North Africa and the Sahel region, the time has really come for America to understand that Libya is in fact a top-tier issue, only a tiny rung below Ukraine, Iraq, and Syria. And therefore, it's about high time to leverage our unique historical, commercial, and diplomatic connections in Libya in an effort to facilitate a reconciliation between the discordant factions that are currently contesting Libya's perilous post-Gaddafi transition. Given that I see today many people from a whole range of backgrounds, I'm going to attempt to sketch my view of the situation from 30,000 feet, and then let this conceptual approach suggest some policy options that we might adopt. After this broad overview and these policy prescriptions, I'll attempt to peel back the many layers of the Libyan onion, dissecting away the detritus of false narratives to get at the core dynamics that drive the country's polarization into two blocks. Now to set the scene. Since the Arab Spring began 4 years ago, whole swaths of the Middle East have been transformed from authoritarian police states into ungoverned, and some might say ungovernable, spaces. In Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, the vacuum left by the receding state has been filled by various sub-state Islamist movements, which provide what we might consider quasi-state functions. Yet even in those countries, those failed states, the national government still retains sovereignty in a legal sense and control over their capital cities in a de facto sense. This is not the case in Libya today. Rogue militias conquered Tripoli in August. Since then, Libya boasts two rival administrations, neither of which I would consider a government, and both claim to be the country's sole sovereign. To preserve a semblance of neutrality, the Libyan central bank pays salaries to the militias and bureaucrats on both warring sides. In this 21st century dystopia, oil money and greed literally fuel Libya's destruction, as both sides cling to the hopes of scoring a decisive military victory, being crowned Libya's sole legitimate government in its aftermath, and then something like riding off into the sunset with the country's oil wealth. While the fighting has recently escalated with each bloc targeting its opponent's key infrastructure, the international community has continued considering the elected House of Representatives, or HOR, based in Tobruk as Libya's sovereign legislature. And yet, on November 6th, the Tripoli-based Libyan Supreme Court ruled that the constitutional amendment giving rise to the HOR was in fact procedurally invalid. One interpretation of this ruling, quite controversial, but it is the one I hold, is that the election should never have happened at all, and that the ensuing body, i.e. the HOR, cannot be vested with sovereignty. Western nations have barely responded to this bombshell, claiming that they are still studying the decision, and meekly pointing out that the Supreme Court's ruling was made under duress. And this is, of course, true, as Tripoli is controlled by militia groups that are hostile to the HOR. Yet the undisguised militia pressure on the Supreme Court does not necessarily invalidate its carefully worded legal opinion, which makes explicit that neither the HOR's opponents nor the former parliament, the GNC, are to be considered Libya's sovereign authority in its stead. Over the past 3 years, a study of the major Libyan constitutional amendments has shown that every single one has been made under intense militia pressure, and yet they have nonetheless received the acceptance of the international community. Why should this Supreme Court decision be any different? In fact, if we look deeper, it is not just the Supreme Court's decision that are the only grounds on which the HOR can be said to lack both legitimacy and sovereignty. It was elected by less than 15% of the Libyan electorate. It controls only a small fraction of Libya's territory. It lacks representation from key ethnic and regional groups who either boycotted the elections or now boycott the body. It holds its sessions without its own legally mandated quorum. Most crucially, and this goes beyond and above all these other things, the HOR does not explicitly derive from Libya's interim constitution. Its very existence is the product of popular militia pressure from the Zintanis and Haftar and others on the previous sovereign legislature to concede a new election after its mandate expired. Tragically, the West's approach to this crisis has relied on an oversimplified narrative which sees, on the one hand, legitimate anti-Islamists in Tobruk, facing off, on the other hand, Islamist usurpers in Misrata and Tripoli. This narrative, however, obscures reality. The fighting has actually descended into a grudge match, only loosely related to religion, and it is sustained by the ideologies of outside actors, not the ideologies of Libyans. Indeed, the HOR is based in an enclave on the Egyptian border, and hence I would like to assert it behaves more like a government in exile than like a genuine sovereign authority. It derives its strength from its most fervent backers, Egypt and the UAE. And they use it to achieve their mission of trying to score a knockout blow against the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the region. HOR-aligned forces have launched several airstrikes against key industrial facilities in Misrata over the last weeks. On Monday, they bombed a Greek oil tanker in the port of Darna to prevent it from servicing the jihadist-controlled town. Conversely, their opponents, termed Libya Dawn, also receive significant financial and ideological support from external sources, namely Qatar and Turkey. And I want to make very clear, inasmuch as I'm going to be criticizing the HOR as a non-sovereign body, I'm not saying that Libya Dawn is a bunch of diplomats and people who exercise sovereign authority. Quite the opposite. The point is, we're dealing with thugs on both sides and a lack of leadership on both sides. So we can correct any things that I've missed in the Q&A. Both sides' anticipation of further outside financial and military support has allowed them to eschew peace talks and hope that their patrons' support will allow them to achieve a decisive military victory. Unsurprisingly, Western bureaucracies have clung to the convenient narrative of an embattled, democratically elected sovereign government that is also an ally in our global fight against terrorism. Paradoxically, this policy has taken away any incentives for the HOR to compromise, while simultaneously allowing destabilizing outside actors to brazenly train, arm, and fund HOR-aligned militias while dropping bombs on their opponents. It has also stymied the UN-led mediation process, which represents the best hope to bridge the impasse between the two sides. In fact, I might be willing to assert that continued recognition of the HOR is antithetical to the UN stated goal of mediation between the two sides. So, as the HOR remains militarily weak, it's unable to, via Haftar, even take back Benghazi, but internationally recognized, it has attempted to transform its precarious legitimacy into hard power by proposing to establish a new national oil corporation, which would then have the sole prerogative to receive payments in exchange for Libyan oil. This spurred its opponents to attempt to seize Libya's key oil terminals over the last month. When their ground offensive was repulsed by the HOR's superior air power in mid-December, they resorted to sabotage, famously using speedboats armed with rocket launchers to blow up gas storage tanks at Libya's largest oil port on Christmas Eve, El Sidra. The current crisis clearly necessitates urgent international action. But another ill-planned Western military intervention is not the way forward. Dirk van der Wal of Dartmouth University, and one of America's leading Libya scholars, recently called for a European peacekeeping force in a New York Times op-ed of November 11th. Similarly, African leaders met in Senegal last week advocating for a NATO intervention to halt the proliferation of arms as a result of Libya's lawlessness. The Tunisians are constantly pleading for Western or Arab intervention to prevent the Libyan poison from spilling over and spoiling their relatively successful transition. Just yesterday, Mali, the country who's been the most destabilized by Libya, had a press conference calling for some kind of Arab League or Western intervention. All their calls make perfect sense given the interests of those countries, and they resonate with some Western diplomats who believe that our favored side, the HOR, could be propped up by what could be termed and sold as a peacekeeping mission. Yet, as we all know, peacekeepers only work when there's a ceasefire agreement to maintain, communal leaders to work with, and nascent institutions to bolster. Moreover, as we're struggling to win the aerial campaign against the Islamic State, it doesn't really seem like there's any political will for military action in this town, and it's totally absent in the corridors of power in Europe. So the fact is, that's a non-starter as an idea. Without any boots on the ground or aerial bombardment, what can we do? The answer is a UN Security Council resolution which could stop the carnage, inhibit Libya's oil wealth from being used to fund terrorists, and depleted and ruining the patrimony of the Libyan people. Declaring that both rival governments in Libya lack sovereignty and that outside actors must desist from funding, arming, or transacting businesses with any Libyan entities would deprive all groups access to Libyan funds abroad or payments for oil. This could be implemented by building on the infrastructure of the sanctions regime as laid down by Security Council resolutions 1970, 1973, and most recently 2174, as well as the recent EU statement that, and I quote, we are finally ready to implement restrictive measures against those fueling violence in Libya. Once this Security Council resolution was in place, and the factors on the ground were denied the ability to receive outside assistance, the legal trappings of sovereignty or the possibility of acquiring the latter via force, both warring blocs would promptly run out of cash and then face big incentives to come to the negotiating table. Only by burying the hatchet with their opponents and agreeing to a national unity government, which would culminate in a constitution ratified by the Libyan people, can Libya regain its sovereignty. This process would be actually in fitting with Libya's own evolving legal precedents. During the anti-Gaddafi uprising, the key players of the NTC acted as the framers of Libya's 3 August 2011 Transitional Constitutional Declaration, which declared that sovereignty emanates from the Libyan people and that any actions taken until a constitutional settlement lack full sovereignty. In fact, the precedent that these far-sighted thinkers came up with is that all governments until the constitutional process are only caretakers, and that after the ratification of a permanent constitution and the selection of a government in line with its dictates, only then would full sovereignty be restored to Libya. Now, critics of the plan that I've proposed, i.e. of delegitimizing the HOR, claim that doing so would be rewarding rogue militias for their brutal takeover of Tripoli and their heinous acts against the Libyan people in violation of human rights and blowing up Libyan infrastructure, as well as their ongoing support of jihadi elements. And that is, of course, a very powerful narrative with which the plan I propose has to contend. But part of the logic of enshrining in international law that only a Libyan government which completes the transitional process can be deemed sovereign is that this would stifle the dream that nurtures the whole spectrum of Islamist elements. That's the possibility of capturing the Libyan state and its resources by force. It is probable that fissures with Russia at present over Ukraine and its military support for the HOR's war against terrorism would make passing a UN resolution impossible. Therefore, I think the first step is to try that resolution, wait for the Russians or the Russians and the Chinese to veto it, and this will expose Russian hypocrisy and attempts to block unified action. And then maybe Western nations will have the will required to multilaterally declare the HOR sovereign to have lapsed in light of a close reading of the Supreme Court decision. And this can be buttressed by various precedents of the ICC that I've been studying and we can go into in the Q&A. It would then be legally impossible for major international firms to have any dealings with the country's oil sector. The Western countries could then follow up this declaration by implementing travel bans, sanctions against key players on both sides, and using their diplomatic leverage to disincentivize both Qatari meddling on the one side and Egyptian meddling on the other. Fortunately, at this moment, sanctions and blocking out formal outside influence would be unlikely to unleash a massive black market, as it has done, for example, in Iraq and Syria. With oil prices at historic lows, the incentives and capacity for rogue actors to smuggle pirated oil onto the open market would be marginal. Finding buyers, even among Russian mafia syndicates or the different Libyan factions' Gulfi patrons, would be quite challenging. Although rescinding the HOR's executive, i.e. the Finni government, the ability to engage in contractual dealings as the government of Libya, although this action might temporarily impose economic hardships on the Libyan populace, harm some Western businesses, and complicate certain diplomatic proceedings, it nonetheless holds the possibility of vast medium-term gain in exchange for limited short-term pain. With Libya a rapidly failing state from which almost all international firms and diplomatic missions have already withdrawn, the further price tag of bold action aimed at fostering a mediated solution is surprisingly low. The current war in Libya is not about religion or ideology. It is about greed and vengeance. By not lending our tacit support to either side and firmly preventing meddlesome regional actors from helping their clients, we could remove the poisonous injections of cash and weapons which drive the conflict. Now I'd like to conclude by expanding on this last point about the conceptual way in which I think vengeance drives this conflict. In my recent report for the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, available online, I put forth the paradigm that the polarization into two blocks in Libya is not primarily driven by religious fissures, and hence, thinking about the conflict as Islamists on the one hand versus anti-Islamists on the other is a flawed paradigm. Instead, we should think of the myriad groups affiliated to either Tobruk or Tripoli as what I term a pro-lustration bloc and an anti-lustration bloc. Now, for all those of you in the audience who detest highbrow jargon and newfangled words, let me tell you that lustration laws are those which ban former members of a previous regime or a ruling party from participating in the new regime. And in fact, everyone is familiar with Iraq's unique form of lustration laws called debathification. And we all know that lustration was pretty much the primary factor for Iraq's failed transition. Now, just to be clear, although I'm putting forth this new paradigm, I'm not saying religious dynamics are not at play. They interact with lustration. No doubt it's difficult to determine which is more dominant, which is the chicken, which is the egg. However, my research leads me to believe that Islamism is actually the cover for lustrationism in the Libyan case, rather than lustrationism serving as the mask for the instituting of a Sharia state. Moreover, I think this optic is far more explanatory for why certain actors support certain blocs, why a rogue former general has emerged as the leader of the Tobruk faction, and why the HOR has essentially raised him to the position of generalissimo, who now blesses all of his crazy declarations of offensives and blockades. The desire for complete lustration is a reaction against Haftar, and it's also a product of NTC and GNC appeasement, which is itself the primary reason why the nascent Libyan center failed from 2012 to 2013 to deal with the problems of statelessness, weakness of institutions, and the recalcitrant periphery. The core act of NTC-GNC appeasement was caving into what you might term the pro-lustration faction, who acted under the guise of Islamism to militarily force the GNC in May 2013 to pass the political isolation law. This key act of appeasement, accepting the political isolation law, meant that no national conversation or compromise has settled this critical issue. Therefore, in my mind, the main unanswered question in Libya today is the extent to which former Gaddafi officials, tribes, and regions can serve in and benefit from high office. This key question must be tackled in any successful mediation attempt to form a national unity government and to regain Libyan sovereignty. All of this means is that an agreed-upon compromise on the political isolation law and the establishment of a truth and reconciliation mechanism must be built into an agreement or constitution on which the new Libyan state is formed. Looking forward, the only way outside of the current impasse is a grand bargain seeking to arrive at fundamental principles that will serve as rules of the political game in Libya and will allow the almost moribund constitutional process to take hold. What is happening in Libya is sui generis, but it's sui generis because of the country's lack of institutions and the dominance of the periphery over the center. It is not actually that unique in terms of the ideological and revolutionary content of the changes. In fact, Libya is not so dissimilar to other historical revolutions. Let's think about the most famous revolution, the French one. It also started off demanding equal rights and democracy, but within a few years it led to the tyranny of Robespierre, which entailed a rather unique form of lustration called the guillotine. This then led to the dictatorship of a rogue general known as Napoleon, and it ended up with the reinstatement of the Ancien regime via the restoration of the Bourbons. Only 8 decades after the start of this revolution did the Troisième République arise, fulfilling the initial aims of the revolution. So Anglo-Saxons in this room run the risk of misunderstanding the typical revolutionary aspect of developments in Libya, which they fail to disentangle from the sui generis Libya-only elements. Seen in this light, Libya needs to emerge from its long-term revolutionary transitional process via a new constitution which creates an entirely new Libyan state and an entirely new foundation of sovereign authority. To conclude, the political isolation law is at the heart of all conflict in Libya. As such, it must be dealt with in any grand bargain. American representatives and other international parties have no place mediating the role of Islam in Libyan society, but they can serve as neutral parties mediating between the pro-lustration and anti-lustration factions, attempting to reach a compromise on this thorny but essential issue. Outside actors, however, can only present themselves as neutral mediators once we stop supporting one side against the other. By continuing to recognize the HOR as legitimate, we are essentially allying with them and fueling the proxy dynamic of the conflict. With so much at stake in Libya and the country in such dire straits, we must reconsider the very foundations upon which Western policy towards Libya is based, or we will forever remain one of the outside actors which drives the conflict instead of one of the neutral powers who is helping to facilitate a solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for those well thought out and very clearly expressed views. Karim, you've heard Jason's sort of analysis of the drivers of the conflict, his very clear sort of suggestions of what policy options might be viable. Please share with us your views.
We agree on a large part of things. I join Jason in thanking the MEI and Paul for this invitation and this gathering, and I also thank you for having said that I have an Italian background, so that I can dispense from explaining why I have a very Arab name and a very strong Italian accent, which usually is what I have to spend if you can't hear?
Yeah.
Now?
Better.
Okay. Thank you very much. A friend of mine from Tripoli, regarding my participation to today's conference, just before leaving the office, I found his email, and he wrote me these 2 lines where he said, "You should highlight the human suffering of the upcoming economic collapse of the country in the next few months. With no income and no currency to pay for salaries and shortage of imported food, there will be a serious humanitarian crisis." I decided to write it before another phrase which I read coming from an eminent expert in another newspaper yesterday, where this expert said, talking about the situation in Libya, even if they get them to talk, they wouldn't achieve anything. Both sides think they stand a strong chance of military victory. Each feels they have enduring support from external supporters, and both feel they have been done a severe injustice by the other party, and would be betraying their followers if they back down. This to me appeared as being almost a eulogy to the whole issue. My position at the point was like, then what? That's it. Then are we supposed just to stay aside and not react? But then there came to my mind the word of the famous Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci, who wrote that sometimes we have to balance the pessimism of the reason with the optimism of the will, and that is what we should do. But before beginning the scenarios that I have laid down, I'd like to reinforce a point which for me is very important, and is the one that my friend Jason Pack has explained already at length. I think that we have to explain and we have to deflate and take out of the picture the issue of Islamism versus anti-Islamism, which is what is fueling the crisis, what is fueling this war and probably the coming civil war. The current crisis, in fact, has been analyzed and discussed from many points of view. I really believe that the division goes back to the origins of the Libyan revolution of February 17, 2011, when the initiative of the rebellion was immediately polarized between that of the high bureaucrats, diplomats, and officers who defected from the regime and immediately formed the TNC, versus the hundreds, if not thousands, of local, tribal, and clan-based initiatives spontaneously originated in the country in a sparse and fragmented way. The first group wanted a change of regime. They're revolutionary, no doubt about it. But within a continuity in a social and in national terms, while the second was formed more by innovators, by people who wanted to radically alter the structure of society, and were imbued with a sense of revenge for the injustice suffered in the past 4 decades. Something very similar to what Jadon talked about, the pro-illustration and anti-illustration division of groups. These two poles never really reconciled themselves. Therefore, Libya conflict today is not between Islamists and anti-Islamists, or we can call them pro-illustration, anti-illustration, or conservative versus innovators. It's a struggle for power. It's a struggle for a vision of what the nation should be. And there are many factors that have caused the collapse of order and the final clash between these two poles. And we can spend hours talking about them, whether that's because of the 40 years of Gaddafi and the way Gaddafi ran the country, his divide and rule, his lack of building institutions, his putting excessive importance on transnational values. Or that can be also the guilt of the first government for the Republic from the post-Gaddafi regime, where a lot of emphasis was used on a consociational way of setting up the government, where everything was given to everybody according to the power that was given, which leads to the collapse of the state institution rather than building them. Or what some eminent colleagues call the hybrid security system. But that's not today the place where we can talk about this. And of course, I agree also with Jadon that it's not that Islamism doesn't play a role. Islamism plays a role in Libya society, there is no doubt. And no doubt there has been a distinction between radical and moderate Islamists on the one hand versus the conservative government of Zidane, that's the one following Al-Thani later on. But Islam, or better Islamism in Libya, has assumed a wider importance because of the fact that each coalition has used it to its own advantage. And this is something that we have to repeat and continually to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. It's not the basic of the conflict or the revolt. It's an excuse. It's an ideological vision. It's an attempt to tie your peculiar struggle for power, your tribal issues, your local necessity to a wider battle, to a national vision. And in fact, each side was entangled in this narrative. And one side used the Islamism as an excuse to gather the support of Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and other forces. While, for example, Libya Dawn have emphasized this to gather the support of the international Muslim Brotherhood and its allies, such as Qatar and Turkey. What I'm saying is that this narrative should be reduced and not blown out of proportion, especially because it does not serve the purposes of peaceful resolution, but on the contrary fuels the rhetoric of war. I would like to emphasize this point as much as possible. If we keep on playing this narrative, there is no solution to war, and then we give right to the first to the article or the expert I was talking at the beginning. Then we have no other scenario than allowing the country to enter into a full-fledged civil war. In fact, this framework definitely complicates any possible solution, because it is not anymore simply a local Libyan affair, as it has been for a while, but immediately gathers the attention of far too many actors, and all of them spoil the situation. And one has only to see what has happened at the Arab League yesterday. I mean, with all this pointing the fingers against everything is Islam or political Islam, just to find a reason to take side in this environment. What are the possible scenarios at this point? We have two large possibilities. One that sees the total collapse of Bernardino Leon's and the UN attempt to mediate, which leaves us with very, very few but clear possibilities. The first one is a partition of Libya. Libya de facto gets divided into 2 or 3 parts, because we always tend to forget the South. We always talk about Libya Dawn and Fajr Libya, we always talk about the East and the West, but we forget that what's happening in the South is almost entirely lost and out of control. We don't know anything about that, about what's happening there. This poses a question for the international community of what to do in the case regarding oil. diplomatic representation, illegal immigration, and all the main issues that come when you have a de facto partition that then you have to interact with, and all the legal issues that might come without it. I think this is the worst scenario because it will take years to stabilize and will exact a high toll on the population and on the infrastructure. It will mean probably the destruction of the Libya that we know today. It is the worst scenario, but indeed a possible one. A second scenario, always within the framework of the collapse of the peace talks, sees a military solution on the victory of one side. This can only be the Tobruk side, thanks to foreign support, which is much superior to the one the other take. This scenario will see a de facto loss of sovereignty because of the foreign influence, an internal split and the permanent state of guerrilla because of the resistance of the forces that have been defeated. It is a bad scenario, but I should say that seeing the way things are going, it is probably a very probable one. Third scenario, we have the increasing collapse of security and the national threat posed to neighbors will cause a foreign intervention. This can acquire various forms. It can be a unilateral invasion from one of the neighbors, in this case Egypt, or a coordinated international peace enforcing force. The first is highly possible, and at a certain point it was the direction where things seem to go. I would see the second one as highly unlikely, even though I think the one has to read with a lot of care the declarations of the French Minister of Defense, or the French Prime Minister, or the Italian Minister of Defense, and some other declarations, where there is an attempt to say, well, if the national interest of one of the neighboring countries is really touched, is really affected, then we can, or our is really affected, then we can conceive a military intervention. Has been said both by the French Minister of Defense as well as by the Italian Prime Minister receiving Sisi a few weeks ago. These are messages that are being sent to the various regional actors, and they tend definitely to spoil any attempt of mediation by Bernardino Leon. Fourth scenario is a UN intervention plus maybe supported by NATO. I think that this is highly unlikely. I agree with Jason. I don't think that will happen. There is no appetite for it, and unless very bad things begin to happen, I don't see how that could happen. In my opinion, I think that there is no alternative in reality to an agreement between Libyan forces, within Libya and by Libyans, supported and fostered by the UN, of course. And I do not want to repeat what Jason just said. We have to start from the premises I outlined above, especially the ideological one, getting rid of what Islam and Islamism do combine, and analyze the real interests of the actors in play, and try to mediate among those. And then, and this is a point which for me is fundamental, and I'm personally not convinced that we are at that level yet, which is the realization by the international actors of the gravity of the situation in Libya. I think that the main actors have not employed all the power, the strength that they can have to reach one of the most important points, which has been emphasized by other before me, and I like to stress, which is the fact that Libya has to be insulated from the efforts or the interference of its neighbors and the regional actors. Pressure should definitely be put in order to prevent any form of help or support, military or non-military, to come from the neighboring country, because that prevents what in conflict resolution is a very important point, which is when you have two conflicting sides, they have to reach what is called the hurtling stalemate point. If both sides really believe that they can make it, they can win a war, they can get enough money, enough support, enough weapons to overcome the other side, and they are not hurting in the position in which they are, they will never sit down, and they will never try to accept the negotiated terms. And that, to me, is the first point that we have to reach. In that case, it will make it easier for the UN to apply its sanctions, of which Jason was talking about before, and reach a ceasefire point. But then, after this point, we should not stop to this. We should be bold also in imagining something that might happen later on. How do you bring, given the fact that let's imagine that you can reach a point where the international community, the main actors, will say, okay, that's enough. Libya really risks to plunge into a crisis, into a civil war. They would destabilize the whole area, the whole region, and everybody else. Let's imagine that's point they reach. Let's imagine you get to a ceasefire. Then what? Then we probably we have to address the real issues at stake, how the repartition of powers. But mainly and mostly we have to be bold in imagining a possible framework for a structure, for an institutional setting. And with other scholars, we have been working on the idea of federalism, which we are just beginning to study, and we are beginning it's a mere hypothesis. We just published with the Atlantic Council a brief with Mohammed El-Jarrah, where what we do, we just say, let's see if this fragmentation is deep enough, and if there are grievances at the local level, if there are instances that should be taken into consideration, maybe having a national unity government that is supported by 2 or 3 or 4 different regions that have a different administration, that have different power, different allocations of resources. Probably it's a way that we should undertake, that we should consider, because that would allow, on the one hand, to maintain, to give enough weight and enough importance to the local forces, to the local instances, while at the same time maintain and save what are the national institutions, a government, a defense, a national, and then what is priority, in my opinion, that we tend to forget, to defend the unity, the nationality of the central bank, of the Libyan Investment Authority, of the national institution. That if we accept their collapse and their repartition, their division as it is going, that will really signify the end of Libya. So I know we have been attacked already by people who say that in a federal system in this moment will not work. It might work if you want that to work. If it is a way for which we can entice groups to be more reliant on the idea of a Libya which is different but still united and still capable of providing its vision and its mission for its citizens, that will be a major step forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karim, for your comments. And you certainly laid out very clear scenarios as to where Libya could be going in the coming year. David, let's hear your thoughts.
Well, I wish I was coming with some real good news after those 2 very optimistic presentations. And when I spoke on Libya last March at an MEI-sponsored conference next door, I gave very cautious support to greater U.S. engagement in efforts to stabilize the country. At that time, many people thought I was too grudging. In retrospect, most of my ideas relied upon a U.S. diplomatic presence inside Libya, along with a security environment that would be safe enough for U.S. companies to risk their capital and, more importantly, their people. Above all, I took heart in the existence of an apparent Libyan partner. Partner is a word you hear all the time in speeches by President Obama. And keep it in mind, because in country after country, we're looking for a partner. Now, it did seem just 9 months ago that we had a partner, although very fragile. The framework for a single Libyan state was in place. Libyans seemed to take pride in their growing record of elections, mostly peaceful transfers of power, and the beginning of a constitutional process that would establish a new norm for Libyan political life. 9 months later, it's much harder to argue for U.S. initiatives. At the national level, there's no obvious partner that combines respect for rule of law and democratic values with the capacity to govern. Karim and Jason know Libya intimately. They care very deeply about the fate of the country. But I want to start with some words of caution before I offer any arguments for a greater U.S. attention to Libya. The worst thing would be for the United States to promise more than it can deliver, either quickly or over a period of at least 5 years that will be necessary for stabilizing Libya. Even more time will be necessary for Libya to stay on the path to democracy and economic development and prosperity. And that takes away from me and others any argument to President Obama that he could burnish his legacy on Libya by some kind of initiatives, or burnish his foreign policy by a Libya initiative. So any positive outcomes would be in the history books. rather than advancing the careers of advocates in either the administration or the Congress. So don't expect any domestic pressure in the U.S. to lead our government to take a Libya initiative. Keeping promises is hardest for a popularly elected government when the national interest is less than clear-cut. Libya's fate is existential for Libyans. It's extremely important for European, African, and Arab neighbors of Libya. It does impact U.S. interests, especially in regional security and counterterrorism, but the case is much weaker than it is for Libya's neighbors. It's going to be a very heavy lift to elevate Libya's place on the U.S. national agenda. Now, if we are looking at possible scenarios for involvement, better a large coalition than engagement that looks like the United States is trying to play not merely a leading but a dominant role. The United Nations, NATO, other parts of the international system are desirable instruments for burden sharing. And in particular, the United Nations enjoys a strong reputation in Libya due to its role in Libyan independence, its early efforts at constitutional governance, and starting with the defense of Benghazi in 2011, United Nations resolutions have been an important component of collective action. UN officials have also played very constructive roles in efforts following the overthrow of Gaddafi. Of course, that's not to say that the UN could do it by itself. The UN is only as strong, only as forceful as the determination of its leading members. But it's really nice to have that UN flag out there, particularly in the Libya context. So there's other ad hoc coalitions, like the Friends of Libya, have been a useful way to mobilize international support from individual governments and more permanent organizations. And they have the added virtue of a place at the table for Arab governments that can face direct security threats emanating from Libya and may have particular assets that supplement American ones. Now, such a coalition will lead to debate. It can delay action. When the direct U.S. national interest is unclear, we have all the more need for a coalition to spread the burden. Of course, our interests are not congruent with Algeria, Egypt, or other Arab states, but our interests often converge. For that matter, we have different perspectives on Libya than Italy and our other NATO and European partners. It's a task of diplomacy to find overlapping interests, form some common goals, not to reach agreement on everything all the time. Now, if that sounds like leading from behind, I say the term reflects good judgment, even if it does not stir American hearts. Individual Libyans may seek greater direct U.S. government involvement in Libyan politics and constitutional development. Many Libyans, however, would resent this, and the resentment would increase as years pass. Libyan politics are a potential swamp into which the United States government wades at its peril. We want Libya to develop security, law enforcement, judicial institutions to protect itself and its international partners without the need for foreign intervention. The United States has the tools to take direct military action in those rare occasions when it would fit with the U.S. national interests. We demonstrated that as the linchpin of the NATO air actions in 2011, in the seizure and return to Libya of a rogue tanker with pirated crude oil, and in the capture for trial of Libyan terrorists. But finding the right target to bomb in Libya is harder than delivering the payload. So I would agree with previous speakers that it is far better to exhaust diplomatic efforts than to reach for the military tool. Libyan factions, as is abundantly clear, appear unable to compromise on a national unity government without the pressure of the international community. The international community has the most leverage if it is relatively united. So adoption by individual foreign governments of particular Libyan clients who lack either constitutional legitimacy or a demonstrated capacity to hold territory and begin the process of governing is very risky. An international coalition also has to be careful, but it can structure relationships with Libyan actors in ways that give them incentives to enter into a constructive dialogue with each other and disincentives against resort to violence to gain a victory over their rival. And to preempt a question, I do not include in my list of disincentives the idea of withdrawing sovereignty rather than an effort to gain Libyan agreement on a framework for continuing to operate a sovereign government. And I'm happy to explain why in the question period. A wide range of Libyan factions need to be represented in a process of dialogue and compromise, even if they are not present at the negotiating table. Of necessity, that's going to include some leaders of militias and military elements that have some blood on their hands. Nor should former technocrats who served in the Gaddafi regime be excluded from a role in the dialogue and in Libya's future. However, the international community, if it's going to convene any kind of negotiating process, has the right to object to individuals and organizations that stubbornly reject dialogue, use wanton violence against civilians, or target international mediators and peacekeepers. There are good arguments for the United States to give more attention to Libya. The positive reasons include contributions that Libya is not making now but could make in the future. Libya has the potential for a prosperous economy that could be a force for stability and development in the Mediterranean, Arab, and African regions. Along with Algeria, Libyan oil and gas can reduce the European Union's reliance on Russian energy exports and the threat of future intimidation coming from Moscow. Ideally, Libya will someday police its immense land area, strategic seacoast, and long borders to prevent their use by terrorists and criminals. We're a long way from that, of course. But conversely, if Libya continues to spiral into the category of a failed state with vast ungoverned spaces, it will become an even more negative strategic reality in these regions. Terrorism, weapons proliferation, criminality, unrestrained migration are clear threats. Libya's location on a long Mediterranean coastline with a southern border open to the African continent would be a liability rather than an asset. A version of Somalia on the Mediterranean would force Western intervention on terms worse than the present ones. Now, it's really treacherous to try to scare the U.S. public into addressing Libya in order to avoid a putative threat of anti-Western terrorism. Aside from the domestic risks of doing such a thing, the argument can play into the hands of factions within Libya or other governments who want the United States to back a particular view that would be unsustainable over the longer term, indeed beyond the short term. If the United States should avoid being the policeman of the world, it's even more important that the United States not become the hitman for any particular foreign interest. So let me agree with Jason and Karim that Libya matters. But what should the United States do about it? I submit that the answer is unclear. We should be modest about the degree to which the U.S. is likely to lead the charge. It would be a defeat for the larger goals of the United States if its Libyan policy were reduced either to irrelevance or to treating Libya as a free fire zone for fighting terrorism. Nor would it be sustainable for the United States to commit itself to bring Libya's principal partner for nation building. That will require international teamwork, and I think that the United States does need to look for an early occasion to bring together this variety of international actors, Arab, African, and European in particular, to deal with this issue. And the UN provides perhaps the best framework. Libyans might think, of course, that they can wait for the international community to come to their rescue. That would be unwise. Any Libyans who imagine that their bargaining position is so strong that they can refuse dialogue until all their terms are met are in for a rude shock. The declining value of Libya's meager gas and oil exports makes it even harder to gain foreign support, and that's true for the House of Representatives in Tobruk. It's equally true for the forces in Misrata and Tripoli today. In the longer term, I'm confident that both the U.S. government and our private sector are willing to play strong roles in Libya's stabilization and development. U.S. firms remain interested in doing business in a less dangerous Libya, and the commercial potential is great. An activity by quality private firms can multiply the effects of official engagement by the United States and its Western allies and avoid the kind of Western occupation for nation building that has been so problematical in Iraq, for example. Given the paucity of its political institutions, Libya was never a good candidate to become the democratic model of the so-called Arab Spring. But it did seem for a while that constitutionalism and the rule of law could characterize Libya's future. I still believe that the Libyan struggle for democratic change was broadly popular, but I fear that democracy is fast getting a bad name.
Thank you, Ambassador Mack, for sharing your views about what the U.S. could or should not do in this very complex situation. Before turning it over to the audience, let me shoot one question to each of my panelists and ask for brief responses. The question to you, David, you've laid out your views about what the U.S. could or couldn't, should or shouldn't. Since sort of the collapse of the situation in Libya, do you see any elements of a policy, whether from any White House statements or Secretary Kerry or the Department of Defense? In other words, your views aside, after the period of partnership is over, are there elements of anything in what remains of Obama's 2 years that might constitute a policy as they see it, or is it simply sort of avoidance and, not? But let me ask the three questions and ask for three responses. Karim, you mentioned the South as an important element that should not be forgotten. Could you, tell us a bit more about what matters, how they might be included, what difference does that make, how that can be brought about? Because indeed you say people talk generally about the two main coalitions. How would you present the South as a player that needs to be integrated? And finally, Jason, on the issue of oil, which is obviously key, it's also key in Iraq, it's key in a number of countries, and it fuels conflict, but at the same time, potentially, it could be part of a solution. I mean, even today, I think, as Karim mentioned, salaries are being paid, and when the situation, when the Gaddafi fell, many people said, well, at least Libya has resources and perhaps has a better chance of moving forward. How would you put the pros and cons of how the oil situation in Libya, is it just conflict and, just negative, or is there also positive potential for that resource? So just brief responses before going to the audience. David?
Well, if I had my druthers, I would like Libya to be far elevated on the discussion agenda between the United States and key international countries, Group of 8, NATO, European Union. But I want some kind of way in which the Arab League, for example, gets involved, because it played an important and useful role in the build-up to the defense of Benghazi. And therefore, I think probably the best place for something like this to happen would be at the next UN General Assembly. And some work needs to be done prior to that to make sure that governments are coming prepared to talk about Libya seriously, and that it not be the case of the United States leading a coalition, obviously, so much as organizing a team of key international players, doing that behind the scenes, so that the Libyan forces will take UN proposals, UN mediation more seriously.
Okay, thanks. Eddie?
How to approach the South? It came to relevant for first when immediately after the revolution the Tuaregs were part of Gaddafi's armies moved south and spilled over into Mali, into Niger and other side, and they started to destabilize the various areas. And we all talked about one of the first consequences of the fall of the regime was in fact the instability in the southern part of the borders because of the lack of control of the Libyan central state over the south and over its minorities and other tribes. It came can still play that role. It can still be the large unknown, the big the stabilizer, or it can be on the other hand a force for positive reconstruction if agreement between the ethnic minorities, the Tebu and the Tuaregs and various other tribes can be reached and can be obtained. At that point, it can have a constructive effect over the northern and western part and the northern eastern part. So it can be seen in both sides. It can be both negative and positive. It depends how the neighbors in the south are affected and how the evolution of the situation in the north is. An agreement between Libya Dawn and Fajr will have to include the Tebu and the Tuareg, and will have a stabilizing positive efforts on the southern part, which at the same time would allow for the control of the southern borders, which is exactly where all the problems start and all the problems get fueled, where weapons start, where the legal immigration gets in, etc., etc.
Thank you. Jason?
Well, with your question there, you hit the nail on the head, Paul, that there is always been about oil a tremendous paradox in developing countries. From the economic perspective, we all know about what's called Dutch disease, i.e. that by having great oil or resource wealth, your economy doesn't develop in terms of its infrastructure and ability to manufacture and human capital. I think that one thing that we've seen in the past decade is that there is a political equivalent to this kind of Dutch disease, and that's that by having vast oil wealth, you get governments and groups who want to compete with each other in a zero-sum way to extract it, kind of like the kleptocracies of sub-Saharan Africa. So oil could be a curse in this way, and what we are experiencing now is a scramble for the oil wealth. The reason in which the Libya Dawn coalition launched Operation Sharuk, or Sunrise, to conquer or otherwise destroy the important oil terminals in the Oil Crescent, Ras Lanuf and Isidra, is because they saw Tobruk trying to monopolize them and gain power and wealth for themselves. So when I have been sitting down with key Libyan stakeholders and intellectuals in London and in Libya, one idea has really struck me. How can we take oil from this curse that drives zero-sum conflict, a desire to deny it to the opponent and extract power from it, into something which would fuel compromise? And I think there's only one person on the Libyan scene who's putting forth a good idea. I hope that you've heard of him. His name is Abdurrahman al-Ghali, and he is a fundamental, a real blue sky thinker. So when he wants to get to the fundamentals, he says, the reason that Libya Dawn, Libya Dignity, or before it in the old days, the Zintani militia, the Misratan militia, the Tuareg, the Tubu, the whatever, the reason that they fight each other is not that they hate each other. It's not that we have ethnic or religious conflict in Libya, but rather we don't have a shared vision of what Libya is going to be. What does it mean to be a Libyan? And until that question is answered, and it's going to have to do with oil, these groups will fight each other. So what Abdurrahman proposes, and I agree with, is something like a national charter, a Libyan Magna Carta, which says, as a Libyan citizen, you have a right to 1/6 millionth of the oil wealth and sovereign wealth of this country, which is inalienable, and we all as Libyans, even if I conquer your town and kill you, I can never take your portion of this. And in a way, this could strike some people as, you know, deriving from Green Bookian ideas and basic people's congresses, but this is a kind of idea on which Islamist groups love for one reason, former Gaddafi officials love for another, the Misratans, the Zintanis. Okay, every Libyan has an inalienable right to use his 1/6 millionth of that wealth to become educated, to help his family, you know, expand and to get married and all of that. And if somehow those legal provisions, a kind of Libyan Magna Carta, could come into being, I believe that the drivers of conflict would be reversed into drivers of progress and human development.
Thank you, Jason. Let me turn to the audience. I'll take a few questions. Start with the gentleman right here. Wait for the microphone to arrive. Just introduce yourself and go ahead. Sure.
My name is Ali Ramadan Abu Zahu. I'm one of the elected members of the House of Representatives who never met, went to Tobruk or joined in there. So I'm one of the boycotters. The question, I enjoyed the three presentations, but there is a missing dynamic I could see. I mean, the Arab Spring, we saw it in Egypt, what is the end of it? In Yemen, what is the end of it? In Syria, it's still struggling. And it's the only place which there is a compromise was Tunisia. But in Libya, the Arab Spring is alive because the revolutionary forces have weapons. If they did not have weapons, it would have been finished. The question here is, why is the international actors are keeping quiet about the regional intervention from the Emirates and the Egyptians in the Libyan internal scene? Why? Why does that's one question. The other question is very important. How can the UN envoy, Mr. Bernardino Leon, succeed in bringing both sides together if the international bodies are only recognizing the HOR as legitimate? You cannot do what you call a straightforward discussion or dialogue if you are siding with one of the without the other.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tfaddali. It's the lady right in front of you.
My name is Farida Allagi. Thank you very much for all the comments. I'm Libyan. I live in the region. I had to leave Libya like many of the political activists left because of the attacks on the human rights activists and the pro-democracy and the liberal and the progressive. I just want to indicate 2 or 3 points. I strongly believe that no, the struggle in Libya is the struggle of ideologies, is the struggle of power, is the struggle of oil, is the struggle of international and regional intervention, not only the Emirates and the Egyptian, the Qatari and the Turks, and God knows whoever also is interfering. Daesh or ISIS, and I was wondering how come you mentioned that, is in Libya. They announced a Libyan ISIS state in Libya. Ansar Sharia are slaughtering and killing and harassing and imprisoning and kidnapping many Libyans. Human rights violation is up in the sky. So now, the training camps that the American media and the Western media recognize is there. The open borders, why the Libyan borders since Gaddafi was gone have not been millions by the European and the Western have been spent, but the borders were open. Why the army and the police have never been put in place. So I think for us living in that part of the world, it is not an ABCD and then forecast scenarios and what's coming up. Every day there is very, very surprising actions that are taking place. So, at the end of the day, allow me to tell you, yes, the international community role has been very, very important in Libya. They have left us to the lion's mouth and they went very fast and very quickly and they wonder why. They have been watching conferences. The Friends of Libya have met 3, 4, 5 times. Meetings, analysis, research, projection. So, why we are asked today in Libya when ISIS is killing all of us and the Islamists are there and it is a real Islamist ideological reality in Libya, why the international community is bombing Daesh and didn't have a dialogue with Daesh? They are asking us to have a dialogue, so why 70 countries are bombing ISIS and they are not having a dialogue with them? Because we have an ISIS state in Libya. So, I think the time has come. At the end of the day, I do hope the rational Libyans, the wise Libyans, the elderly, the women, we the women are paying the biggest price of this game that's going on. And let us be honest again. Throughout history, whether now it's not you, the West, and we, the Arab, and you, the West, and we, the Muslims. Sadly enough, I'm a Muslim woman of the 21st century. Very saddened with what's going on. So, I do hope that the understanding, our tribes, our wise people, our civil society, our youth, we were in Egypt only 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, and we need to get together as Libyans, rational, wise, without eliminating anybody, and without the hate is to the bones. The blood is everywhere. Our best friends have been, no, I'm finishing. And I think, no matter what we say, the hypocrisy, we need to stop this international hypocrisy. Democracy, whether 25% or 5% elected HOR. The parliament is legitimate, no matter what everybody is trying to deny that. On one hand, do election, have election. Election comes with, because all the elections that took place in Libya, the seculars have been winning, not the Muslim Brotherhoods. And all the problems happened after they lost the election, and they have really created this mess.
Thank you, Farida.
I'm sad that I have many friends from Muslim Brotherhood. We need, as Libyans, the international community, the UN never solved any problem. Yemen is back, they're killing each other. And we as Libyans are the ones who have to save our children, our elderly, and those who are dying.
Thank you, Farida. Any other question here? Let me go, yes, gentleman in the third row.
Hi, I'm John Mason, a long-time student of Libya, and is this on? Yeah. And I was wondering, looking at the past of Libya when it was unified and had some stability in the pre-Gaddafi era under the Senussia, who were capable of unifying the country and fighting war against Italy, long contracted war. I was wondering, do you see any lessons from the socio-cultural, religious history of Libya that might shed some light on how Libya could reconstruct as it continues wending its way into some sort of solution?
Thank you. Last question from Bill.
These questions?
And then, yeah, I'm going to take notes of the questions and we'll have a round of answers.
Bill Lawrence, I'm glad you went with the two Libyans first, because we really hear this interview, but I find myself somewhere between Farida and Andy in making a couple of quick points.
I'll bring the microphone closer to you.
Yeah, first, Lustration wasn't a reaction to Haftar. Haftar was a reaction to the assassinations. And if you don't sort of understand why Haftar rose the way he did in the Benghazi context, then you can't really. I would argue that it's not really pro-lustration against anti-lustration, it's pro-revolution against anti-Islamist. So it's this massive dialogue of the death. I would also venture that appeasement wasn't the issue here, as your previous piece pointed out. Appeasement by another name is dialogue. And when you look at all the cases of so-called appeasement, you actually have the fragile deals that were made that kept Libya more or less somewhat on track in the 12 and 13 period. And we actually need more of those deals now, not less of the deals, nor the frame of appeasement. I also argue that the American Revolution, my second to last point, offers an interesting comparison as opposed to the French one, in that the U.S. Fighting one foreign power allied with another foreign power, and then made internal Faustian bargains over slavery that took 60 years to work themselves out. And I would venture that there are a number of Faustian bargains that need to be made within Libya to get things back on track. Which gets to my last point. I think, and this gets back to Ambassador Mack's, those that haven't worked in diplomacy often feel you can punish people into good actions. I see too much talk these days about sanctions on players and about withdrawing funds, when both sides have demonstrated a desire to fight whether or not they get paid. They want to get paid, but they will fight without getting paid, and they'll take the money from wherever to continue the fight if there are reasons for the fighting. So I would argue not an abdication towards a UN resolution that's not going to pass because of a Russian veto, because of Ukraine, and that's clear. I would argue that we need increased engagement with all the parties within Libya. We need that very dialogue, which you are advocating. We all end up at the same place. There needs to be an internal Libyan dialogue. I mean, funny that you and me presented very different points of view from the two sides of this, and yet I saw you greet each other coming in. You're good friends, you know. And there's plenty of people, in Libya, right, who can make these political deals.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody who posed the question or point of view. Let me go David, Karim, Jason, and pick any parts of the comments or questions, but briefly as we're running out of time.
Yeah, well...
Microphone on, David. Thanks.
Yes, I think we had a really good example between Farida and Ali of the difficulty, even in this kind of environment here, of bringing these two poles of Libyan opinions into some kind of useful dialogue, which is why it's going to take some kind of international intervention. I think we're all agreed that reaching for the military tool, some kind of military intervention, whether it's by the international community writ large or whether it's by individual countries picking and choosing in the clients that they support with military force, is not helpful. And I think the point that Bill just made, that you cannot punish people into being reasonable and engaging in some kind of productive dialogue. I think that's very true. And that's why I would say it's not a good idea for the UN to say, okay, we're going to deprive both sides, any parties in Libya, of sovereignty until they come together and come up with some kind of reasonable solution. All it's going to do, it may be of limited cost to the United States, Europe, global community, but it's going to be of huge cost to Libyans. You don't start this process by overthrowing one regime and then completely doing away with all institutions of sovereignty. We did that in Iraq. We know we're still trying to overcome the burden of not having a fully, legitimately recognized government in Baghdad. So let's not start that same process with Libya.
Thank you. Karim?
Yes, I don't know where to begin.
Or to know where to end.
First of all, yeah, where to end, I know very quickly. Ali, I agree with you. There are many theories why the US keeps quiet on Egypt, or the other international actors keep quiet on the Egyptian Emirates intervention. Can be anything. Can be that Libya is simply a bargain chip for the support of these countries against ISIS in Iraq. It can be because they cannot do much against it. It can be because of Egypt is too much of a strong actor, etc., etc. But definitely yes. It's one of the topics I addressed, is the importance that the strong countries exercise all their efforts to defend the mediation. If the United Nations mediation has to succeed, it has to be done with the whole international support. You cannot have countries who say, yes, we are in favor of mediation, and then arm one side or support the other. That will definitely cause the collapse. And that is why the UN gives only the legitimacy to Tobruk. Tobruk is the legitimate government. But by stressing the fact that the United mediation has to be done between two different sides, they are in a sense putting the two forces at the same level, so that a negotiation or a hurtling stalemate can be reached and the possibility is done. Because the alternative would be just siding entirely with only one. And that's not what the Bernardino Leon and the UN are trying to do. Farida, it's you raised too many issues. One important point is why the UN left Libya quickly. That's the NATO, you said. Left Libya immediately after the revolution. Now they recognize that it was a mistake. But I wouldn't give the blame to the international community for that. The blame was Libyan. Remember Jibril's speeches. Remember the part of the elites. The Libyans did not want, and I'm deeply convinced of that. Libyans did not want an international oversight because they thought those Libyans at the time, those first elites, they thought that they could govern the country the way they wanted and exploit its resources the way they wanted. So I wouldn't put the blame on the international community. It really is on us. We overstress the self-capacity to govern and the honesty of these kind of people. But then there are ISIS. ISIS is important. Yes, there is ISIS, but it's really minimal. It's not, that is not the issue. The issue is what to do with Ansar Sharia. The issue is what to do with the much more numerous jihadists who are by far superior and stronger than ISIS. And that's where I blame Haftar, because Haftar action, it's true, it was on a reaction of the assassination. But by doing that, by reacting that way, and I don't give him, the honesty, I think he's an opportunist. What he did is take the opportunity to stage a war, but made a big mistake, which is lump all the Islamists together in one side and put them all in a corner, which is what, despite all its mistakes, Zidane always avoided doing. Zidane, by paying everybody, allowed them, in a sense, to be divided. Haftar, with his action, united them and created a united front, and thus had the convergence of the ideological interests with those of the local power interest of the Misrati and other cities. Thus created its own enemies, and that is definitely part of the big mistake that was happening. If an agreement is reached between the two parties, ISIS and the jihadists, will be dealt with effectively. I am convinced that they are not a threat for the state. If these two major forces unite and find national unity government, the terrorists will be dealt with police-wise and with the support of the international community, which will come because the government will be united. They will be dealt with very easily. So that's why I tend not to stress that out, because that is instrumental for Haftar and company to gather support for their side, and that may be useful at the short term, but in the medium and long term, it will be disastrous for the country. I don't know if I make myself clear. And go ahead, Jason. Otherwise, I can go on for hours.
I agree with everything that Karim has said, and I think I agree with everything that Karim has just said, and he very eloquently pointed out, you need to bring together the solid middle against the extremes, and this is why I support Bernardino Leon's and Jonathan Powell, the UK Special Envoy's approach, which is that you have to talk to moderate Islamists and maybe even some, not so moderate Islamists to get a coalition of the willing against the Takfiri jihadis. And that is something that could be possible. And Karim pointed out a way to achieving that. Now, because I want everyone to feel that their questions were addressed, I believe the third gentleman, John Mason, said, what can be learned from the time in which you said that Libya was united under the Senussi and the war against Italy. That's kind of funny that you put the question that way. I am a historian of the Senussi, and guess what? They never united Libya, and they sure as hell didn't unite it in their jihad against Italy. That was an extremely disunited period of Libyan history. You need to look at the work of, say, Ali Ahmida, as well as that of Anna Baldanetti. What happened, of course, was that the struggle against Italy highlighted that Libya is entirely a fictional colonial creation. And in the Ottoman period, obviously, there's no Libya. The Senussi were powerful in Cyrenaica, but not all of it, mostly non-coastal Cyrenaica. And when they allied with the British, throughout all of their history, they lost credit in Tripolitania, and British attempts after the failure of the Bevan-Sforza Pact in 1949 to create a unified Libyan government, of course, didn't succeed, and that's why they had to settle for federalism. So study of that period shows, in fact, how deep the fissures are regionally as well as religiously in Libya. Now, moving on to Bill's very wittily worded questions. I mean, I thought I was getting a poem there, Bill. Very, very, very funny stuff. I realized, in fact, that you caught me in one misstatement. I think I left my piece of paper for 2 seconds to try to roll with the flow, and I said that lustration is a response to Haftar. That's, of course, false. I misspoke. Lustration is intrinsic in any throw the baby out with the bathwater revolution, and that's what we had in Libya. We had to throw the baby out with the bathwater revolution, and the Thawar said, anyone associated with the old regime, you're out of here. And Haftar is a response to that, but the Thawar, the more that they got appeased, and now I'm going to say that I disagree on this point, the more that they got appeased, the more their salaries got paid, they grew in power. And maybe you know our colleague Florence Gaub, based in Paris, but she's a lovely German woman. She told a great story when she and I were briefing the MOD together. You know, the militias are like the gremlins or the goblins or whatever. And I was like, how do you mean? And she really got these military guys thinking. It's because in that movie, the gremlins are all nice and furry and whatever, but they're not allowed to eat cheese after midnight. Once they eat the cheese after midnight, they become crazy. This turns out to be like the militias. They were all well and good when they are fighting against Gaddafi and whatever, but once you pay them and institutionalize them after the fall of the regime, well, they grow 3 or 4 times fold and they try to create smuggling networks. So that was appeasement. They didn't need to have, instead of DDR and SSR, they enshrined the militias and made them crazy. So I don't think appeasement is a dialogue. And I know that Dirk and you and others have said, no, 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 it was in the appeasement time that we kept the channels open so that there wouldn't be an overt conflict. I think it's rather that they chose the wrong time to provoke. You know, in the beginning, the central authorities were stronger than they are now. They would have been able to have put off the extent of the attack by the Misratans. And then the American Revolution, again, a fascinating point, and of course we can draw different examples. The American Revolution is not a baby out with the bathwater revolution. It's not a full revolution. And a lot of scholars of revolutions would say that the Russian and the French are real revolutions and the American is not. Yeah, it was a war of independence. It was English gentlemen who wanted to have their Magna Carta rights and no taxation without representation, which is an English kind of idea. So,
it's our revolution.
Yeah, I'll leave that aside.
We do have to conclude also, so be brief.
Okay. David has made the very interesting point drawing out on what you're saying, which is that you can't punish people into good actions. I'll conclude by saying, why did I unveil today, and this is my unveiling of this idea before I go on a sustained writing campaign about that there is no sovereignty in Libya? It's because we need a nuclear option, but through diplomacy. The situation has become so bad that all of the conventional arsenal has been tried. You've tossed Bernardino Leon, you've done a diplomatic this, you've done that. It's all been exhausted. So this isn't about punishing anybody. It's about saying we need to do everything to stop the outside actors from fueling the fire inside Libya. And money is poison just as much as arms. And as it flows into Libya, it justifies and drives this conflict. And as an international community, we need to do our best to try to help the Libyan people sit down together. And as we've seen today, the two sides can share some narrative where the Venn diagrams meet and think about how they can create a country that they'd want their own children to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. This has been a very rich panel on a very complex issue, and I'm glad that there's also been sort of controversy in the views expressed and the dialogues. That's always a good sign of a good panel. And thank you all for coming on this very cold day in the beginning of the new year. And I thank Megan and the MEI team who made it happen. And please join me in thanking our panelists today.